Welcome everyone to the JV Media Digital Drop-In. I'm so excited to have you all here. My name is Sarah Benoit. I'm the co-founder and lead instructor of the JV Media Institute, and I'm here today with an amazing guest that I'm really excited about, Marilyn Ball, and we're going to be discussing the art of podcasting. So as I mentioned, as we go through the webinar today, you do have the chat available and the Q&A. Feel free to drop any questions that you have into either of those areas, and I'll be monitoring them as we go along. Also, at the end of this webinar, you will get a follow-up email. You'll get a copy of this recording. You'll also get a copy of the presentation slides. So although you can feel free to take notes, don't feel like you have to write everything down. You will get a copy of everything, and you'll be able to click on the links and explore some of the different resources that we're providing today. But again, I'm really excited to have Marilyn Ball here with us. She does a number of podcasts. The one that I'm most familiar with is Speaking of Travel, which I've actually been a guest on. And she's actually been located in Asheville, North Carolina for quite a long time and had a really amazing career in marketing, promotions, communications. She's the author of The Rise of Asheville, which is a really fascinating look at building community in our city here. But welcome, Marilyn. We're so glad to have you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm really happy to be here. I've been looking forward to this.
So really quick, before I jump into a few podcasting details I want to share with everyone, I wanted to ask you really quick, where is this photo from that we used for the promos?
That is from southern Spain. And that was a trip that I took with a group of friends a couple of years back. And we actually spent a week on the coast of Spain and then went over to Portugal. So it was one of my very favorite trips.
Very cool. So I know Marilyn and I share a big love of traveling, which is why I wanted to feature our two photos up here. And just to share with you all, this is a picture of me in front of Graceland. I went there for the first time in 1999, and then I went back in 2019, and I took a photo of myself from last year that's exactly like the one I took in 1999. So I now have two photos of me at Graceland, kind of in very different eras of my life, which was really fun. And I did a solo trip to Memphis that year, which was just really exciting to get to know the city and to explore all the new things there after not being there for 20 years. So just so you all know, like I said, Marilyn and I are big travelers. If you have been experiencing a little bit of sadness because you're not traveling this year, we both understand greatly. That's been something I'm really getting used to, being in Asheville full time without leaving it all. But to start off, I wanted to just give everybody just a basic overview. We're not going to dig into this too much. This is really for you to have some slides after this actual webinar to dig into learning more about podcasting if you're interested. But I just wanted to sort of give a quick overview of what is podcasting. So podcasting, according to the Pew Research Center, which is, a group of people that have been doing a lot of research about different digital communications over the years, they say podcasting is a way to distribute audio and video programming over the web that differs from earlier online audio and video publishing because the material is automatically transferred to the user's computer and can be consumed at any time. So things like using an Apple iPod, using a portable digital music player, using iTunes, these type of systems where you don't necessarily need a Wi-Fi signal all the time to get access to the content, which is what makes it a little more unique, I think, than, let's say, just doing a video series on YouTube or live streaming on a social media site, something like that. Podcasting was first coined by a journalist named Ben Hammersley. You can actually click on this link and read his article from 2004. And so it's really interesting, I think, to sort of realize that podcasting does have sort of a relationship in my mind to radio. I'm a big radio person, and so that's where podcasting became something that I really immediately kind of was attracted to, because I love that form of kind of audio storytelling. I'm a big NPR fan, especially This American Life. So those type of things I think really made me kind of gravitate towards this in the early 2000s. And there were already kind of podcasts happening before 2004, but Ben Hammersley is really when we started using that word, really talking about it in a different way. And when it comes to where we're at in 2020 with podcasting, you can see from this graph, it's really grown over the last 14 or 15 years. So in 2006, only about 22% of Americans were familiar with podcasting. Now we're at 75%. So it's become something, like I said, sort of like radio that's become very normal for people. And if you look at the stats from 2020, it's kind of amazing because obviously in the last 6 months, there's been a big jump in people's activity around this type of media. In 2019, there were an estimated 88 million podcast listeners in the United States. And then again, when it comes to how many people are actually listening to US podcasts now, you can really dig into a great study that they recently put out through the Edison Research and Triton Digital group. They basically do kind of a series of podcast statistics that give you a number of kind of details around how this media is working, who's interested in it. I think because they're realizing more and more people, individual people as well as brands, are looking at how they can use this medium to, like I said, really tell stories and really make more personal connections with their listeners. So over half of Americans have listened to a podcast. 37% of them listen to them every month. As of 2020, if you're between 12 and 34, almost half of you are listening to at least one podcast every month, which was actually kind of a jump from last year, like I said. So the whole situation between January and now has really, I think, amplified the value of this medium. But that doesn't mean it's just younger people who are doing it. There's also a ton of people that are in that over 55 market. About a quarter of those people living in the US are actually listening to podcasts as well. So this is why I think this is an exciting topic. And I also think it's fun for some people that I work with to explore this topic because they may not be as comfortable having their face on screen and doing just video content. So the podcasting basics that we're going to talk about today are really kind of just understanding what this medium is, and then I'll let Marilyn share a little bit more about how she's actually implemented this on her own, learned things on her own, and is now actually helping other people put podcasts together. So I'm going to start with our questions, and maybe with this question as well, Marilyn, you could share a little bit about what inspired you to get started in this realm. But I'd really love to know, what is podcasting really in your mind? How do you define it? And like I said, what inspired you to get involved in it?
Well, I really was quite fortunate because when you were talking about radio, when I first started, it was because I was at a turning point in my career. I was at a place in my company. I'd been in an advertising agency for 18 years, working with tourism and small business and hospitality, emerging markets, if you will. And marketing back then in the 90s was really different. There were a lot of formulas and you had to adhere to certain uh, ways of marketing. And over time, I left the company, started my own company, became an entrepreneur, and really started to look at what I wanted to do, which really was about communications and public relations. But I ended up going to this World Domination Summit out in Portland, Oregon. It was a summit that Chris Guillebeau put on, and it was about travel, adventure, and service. And those three words, those three images just kind of spoke to me. So I went out there and I met people from all over the world who were really looking at, what can I do with my life that I love? What does that mean? How do I go for that? Whether it was leaving your day job or having a side hustle or looking at something that would move you towards what brings joy, service, adventure, travel, whatever into your life. And when I came home, I was like, what is that? What is that for me? And of course, as you and I were saying, travel is something that is, I was very fortunate for a decade to have a lot of opportunities. And I knew I was coming to a time in my life that was going to be a little different, but I love hearing people's stories when they come back from a trip or when they're even getting ready to go. And in Nashville, you know, you can't go anywhere without somebody telling you where they've just been or where they were getting ready to go. And so I heard at a dinner party one night, somebody talking about a radio show that he was doing on food and wine. I was like, where are you doing that? Now, I grew up in a radio family. My family listened to the radio all the time. We had a radio in every room in our house, and I'm, oh, like you, a big fan. Uh, so I knew a little bit about radio from my media hat. And I went and talked to this guy who was just starting a small community-based radio station. And I said, would you consider letting me talk to my friends for 30 minutes and have my own little show about travel? He's like, sure, let's do a pilot. Oh man, a pilot. You know, I was like getting into it. And I brought in my friends. I mean, literally, I just like called people I knew who had had these incredible adventures and let them talk for 30 minutes. And after a couple of years, I realized I want this to go bigger. This little hobby is something that I'd like to see expand. And because I knew people over at iHeartRadio, I went over there and, you know, again, I can't stress this enough. Sometimes just asking, what have you got to lose? You know, so I went over and I said, hey, did you know I had a radio show? They were like, no, we had no idea. Why would anybody know? It was a small community-based radio station. Not many people were listening, but I convinced them to listen. And over a couple of months, they brought me on and I started to have a show. It was an hour. They made it an hour-long show. It aired on Saturday and Sunday morning. I have my own producer. So my show, speaking of travel, really was a radio show when I started in 2000. Well, this is my, so I started in 2013. I went over to iHeart 2015, 16, somewhere around that time. And so podcasting, like you were saying, was not really a thing. It was just emerging. People were uh, just beginning to read the articles that you posted, to listen to people talking a little bit more. And I was fortunate because iHeart would put my show on the radio, but then it was also uploaded to the iHeartRadio app. And over time, iHeartRadio started realizing, oh, this podcasting thing is really something. Why don't we buy our own podcasting platform? And so they ultimately did. And suddenly I was a podcaster. So I started looking at, well, what does that even mean? And I was very fortunate because I found Buzzsprout. I don't know if you've ever heard of Buzzsprout, but it's a podcasting platform where you can actually upload your um, MP3. Buzzsprout is an educational platform as well. So it's a community and it's a platform where you can put your podcast, but it's also a community where you can get education. So when you ask, what's my definition of podcasting? I have a better understanding now because I've been doing it for 8 years and I'm involved in a lot of communities of people who are starting podcasting. And when I talk to people, I really feel that what you're doing is marketing. It comes down to marketing. You're marketing yourself. You're marketing uh, your guests, your topic. It becomes something of a tool in your toolbox that can really attract your target market. And I think that's where I've seen the paradigm change the most is that instead of really looking at, well, what is your return on the investment? You're really looking at who's listening to your topic and who cares about what you're saying and who is going to endorse you and endorse your sponsors. So I really look at podcasting as a marketing tool.
Yeah, and I think it's really helpful for you to point that out because I think as I've explored podcasting and listened to a lot of them, thought about starting my own. I'm still playing with that idea. It's interesting how it really is different depending on who you're talking to. So I definitely think there's podcasts out there that people do for the sole purpose of their passion, and then eventually it morphs into something more. There's also, I think, a lot of great podcasts that were created specifically for, like you said, really marketing and communicating with the audiences. So I think it's a tool that you get to kind of infuse with your own purpose in a lot of ways.
Right.
So you kind of already shared how you got started just with iHeart and things like that. But I know now you've kind of moved beyond, speaking of travel, and you're doing other things. So can you just talk a little bit now that you kind of shared with us how you got into like, oh, I'm a podcaster. Like, how have you continued to move that forward? So I know like now you're really even helping produce other podcasts.
It's interesting how the times are changing. And uh, s- here I was in a radio station for 5 years with my producer. Uh, every week I would go into the station and he would sit across from me and had a big board, and all I had to do was put on my headphones and connect with my guest, whether in the studio or on the phone from anywhere in the whole wide world, uh, and go. And it was all done. Pre, it was all packaged. What I had to do was to then upload the MP3 myself onto I have my own podcast platforms that I use besides iHeartRadio that enables me to get into, now I'm on Pandora and iTunes and Spotify, just about every podcast platform. But it was a gradual getting to that place in recognizing that uh, I had somebody doing all the work, and then I could really market it and do what I needed to do on my end. And then there was uh, a shelter in place order for everybody. And the radio station said, you can't come here anymore. We can't accommodate this right now. So in order to keep your show going, you do it and you get us the pieces. And so my producer, Randy, and I, he also had a home studio. Uh, he and I did a lot of research, and I went to Buzzsprout and researched there, and ended up purchasing a podcasting engineering uh, setup. So I I did a lot of research into what other podcasters were doing uh, bigger than me, and decided on a certain board, an 8-track board. Uh, I have the microphone, the whole setup, but I had to learn how to use all of that, and I had to do it quickly. In fact, I had to use my phone the first week and figure out how I could record it. It's somewhat counterintuitive, but also it's also very intuitive that, oh, I need to do this and I need to connect here. Uh, I'm not the most tech savvy person. That's I do other things really well. That's not one of them. So it was very challenging. Luckily, I had good mentors and instructors, and I paid somebody. This is something else that as a marketing person, I would want to get out there to anybody listening. But, if you really are interested in creating something of your own, you need to make an investment. It's not going to be maybe money that you have at hand right now, but it's an investment that this is a passion. This is something I want to keep doing. And so I made that investment, and then I paid somebody to help me through FaceTime. And each week I would send my files. I have guests scheduled through September right now, and I wasn't going to lose them. And even though people aren't traveling, people are still connecting, and we have to keep connecting. And so uh, I made this decision. I was going to learn how to do this, and here we are now. And I've pretty much learned how to use this. I'm not an expert by any means, but every week I can get Randy, my producer, the files. Now I've learned an edit suite that I have, a software that I can actually record on with my mixer and then go in and take away breaths or uh, amplify the sound, I can figure it out. I can listen and say, oh, this is how Randy would do it. Let's see if I'm doing it like that. And when he sends me a text back that said, wow, that was spot on, I feel really proud.
No, and thank you for sharing all that because I think it's important because even though I do something a little different right now, which is mostly online classes, webinars, and longer programming online, I had to do the same thing. I didn't have any expertise in audio video of any kind. I had to learn about the equipment. I had to ask a bunch of people I know questions to get their feedback. And then over time, I kind of built my setup. So I want to encourage everyone, if you took nothing away from today's webinar other than the fact that it is possible to do it. This isn't a world just for technical people with experience. It's really about, I think, your motivation and your passion to how much you want to get the message out. And if you really want to get the message out, then you really can go online and learn from people how to put your system together. And then you can always improve upon it. So you don't have to feel like everything's got to be perfect out the gate. It's like start somewhere, begin the process, and then really figure out over time. Because I feel like my setup, if you were here, you would see I have a whole little recording kind of pop-up spot that I can do in different places. And, I've been refining that for 5 or 6 years, getting a better mic, getting a better headset, adding different pieces to it, learning different software. So I just encourage everybody that you can do this. And I want to go back to something you said, Marilyn, about how you're distributing your podcast. So could you share a little with everybody about how are people actually listening? Because this is a part of podcasting I think gets confusing, is that there's all these kind of different channels. So like you started with iHeart, but then you have your own system for distributing other places. Can you just explain that in a little more detail for everyone?
Absolutely. So again, all of this has been emerging. So it wasn't like, oh, you could just suddenly, unless you were NPR or one of the, like a radio station, you could upload your audio file to the stream, to the out there. And now there are so many different platforms that you can put your podcasts on to get them distributed, including your own website. I mean, if you have a rudimentary website, even you could have your podcast, your audio on your website. And I also want to just say that through the years, as I've gotten to know people who have created their own podcasts, sometimes they're just about talking to people, they have a certain somebody that they want to connect with, people who do certain things, school teachers or church goers or people that are in their circle. They just want to talk to them. That's a podcast. That's somebody could do that. And but I was fortunate because back when I first started in 2013, when I went over to iHeart, I realized, I want to be able to distribute these podcasts as well besides on iHeart. And that's when I discovered Buzzsprout. And it was a platform that's really easy. That was what I liked about it the most. It was free and it was easy. Uh, Over time, as more and more that I uploaded more and more episodes, I realized I needed to pay. And I think for speaking of travel, I think I pay $18 a month to be on Buzzsprout. And over the time that I started uploading and having my podcast, speaking of travel on Buzzsprout, they started growing as well and became bigger and bigger connectors to the bigger world. So it's kind of like, in the travel industry, when you can go to one site and find all your pricing. When you go to Buzzsprout, it's kind of one-stop shopping because from there you can take what is known as your RSS feed, and they give you the links to send it off to all the other distributors. And then you get approved. They have to approve it. You have to send a little synopsis. But then once it's approved, then you're on. You're like, I'm on iTunes, I'm on Google Play. If you just Googled speaking of travel, you would find a click to get to it. So it's just taken a little bit of time, but that's how I distribute mine. And I do it every single week. I have a show. So I actually looked at my Buzzsprout the other day, and I have well over 350 episodes. Those are 350 people that I've spoken with over the last couple of 5 years who uh, who have changed my life, changed other people's lives, and it keeps on going. And like you were saying, people are listening. They are finding the information and finding the topics that interest them. And I'm fortunate because travel is something that we're all missing right now.
No, definitely. And I want to just point out to everyone one of the reasons that I think what Marilyn's sharing is so valuable, because a lot of times people ask me, well, what's the difference between creating a podcast and just doing social media live streams or, something like that. And I think the biggest thing is exactly what Marilyn shared, which is you're giving people a way to receive your content in the medium that they prefer. So when I live stream on Facebook, although that can have great value and I can even live stream regularly, or maybe I can do a show on YouTube and I put out my show every week. And a lot of podcasters do mix their podcasting with social media strategy in some ways. But I think the biggest difference is that when you start to distribute the podcast across that ecosystem, like I said, people who regularly listen to iTunes get to listen to it on iTunes. People who regularly listen to Google get to listen to it on Google. And so instead of requiring them to be on Facebook to get access to your information, you're allowing them to bring your content into their world in a way that they prefer, which I think makes kind of a big difference.
And I do want to just say that one of the other benefits of being on a platform like Buzzsprout is that you get the analytics. So again, analytics is not something that I was ever, I mean, I certainly in marketing and advertising, I looked at the numbers, I understood the return on the investment, et cetera, et cetera. But being able to look at the analytics of who's listening to my show, where they're listening from, I can see on a map where people are listening from. And there are people from Tehran. There's been people from Australia. There have been, because when my guests come on the show, and I have a guest who has 1 million followers, and they post my podcast on their social media domains, then their listeners will listen to my show to hear that guest. And that guest could have people all over the world. And I can see how many people are listening in real time. That's very cool.
Yeah, for $18 a month, that's awesome.
It is.
So can you give us a rundown of the basic steps for creating a podcast? I know there's a lot of detail that could go into that, but what are kind of the things if people are starting out, especially they need to remember, are kind of the building blocks?
Right. Well, the first thing that you need to remember, the first thing you have to do is to pick a topic. Like, what is it that you're going to want to talk about? And again, uh, if you really are interested in creating a podcast, then you need to be on board with your topic. Like, it needs to be something that's kind of heartfelt or soulful or um, just really passionate for you. And even if that's talking about, oh, the new phones are out and, here's some information. It could be really cut and dry, but it's information that you care about giving to other people because you've done the research. So definitely pick your topic, and that will make it the easiest. And then you'll need to decide what kind of format you want to use to do it. Are you going to put it on your website? Are you going to put it up on a Buzzsprout or another platform? How do you want your episodes to be out there in the public? And also, how do you want your episodes to be, period? Do you want a 30-minute podcast or a 20-minute podcast? Do you want to do, my podcast for Speaking of Travel is like 40 minutes, and then I've got some commercials. And I've spoken to people who said, gosh, I don't know if I can talk for 40 minutes. That's a long time for me. But they do. People love to talk. But then they get equipment. That's the other thing, is to really do your homework. Do some research, like you were saying, Sarah, talk to people. One thing about this community, it is a community. People love to talk about their equipment and what kind of equipment they're using. You know what I'm saying? So ask around. Real. When I first started, I had software on my phone, like I said. It was called the iRig. It hooked up to I had to buy a couple of pieces, but it all hooked up to my phone. And I could actually go on location and interview people through the iRig. Just, figure it out. And then you're going to want to design something that's your own, kind of maybe not a logo. You don't really need a logo, but have something that is unique to you, that is your artwork and your title. I mean, that's another thing. And I really want to stress that because when I came up with Speaking of Travel back in 2013, my logo is actually Speaking of Travel with Marilyn Ball, no passport required. That's the whole thing. And I trademarked that. Again, an investment. I hired an attorney and I actually trademarked that. And I was glad I did because at some point someone approached me and said they had trademarked no passport required and my using that infringed on them. But it turned out because I had an attorney and I had done it through an attorney that was not the case. So I'm just saying, if you're committed, there are lots of ways you can trademark, but own it. Pick a title and own it. Design your artwork. Then just start recording, like record an intro. Hi, mine is, hi, this is Marilyn Ball, your host of Speaking of Travel. You're listening, blah, 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 blah. It's the same thing every week. And then at the end, I have an outro. Thanks so much for being with me. Then I'll give a little upbeat, go out and do something really great this week. And then I always end with, remember, life is short. Don't postpone joy. I wanted to use something from my friend Laurie, who I loved, and she had coined that phrase. And I asked her sister after she died if I could use it, and she gave me permission. And it's to me, every time I say it, I'm connecting with people who believe that. And then just plan your launch. When are you going to launch it? Are you going to do a pilot? Or are you going to do it? How are you going to do it? Are you going to put it out on Facebook, put it out on your Instagram, let everybody know, hey, I have a podcast, tune in. And then just kind of figure out, what's my learning curve here? How long do I want to invest in this? And this is a good segue because you had asked me earlier about the other podcasts that I'm doing. And it ties into what are your basic steps. So I have had a very successful radio show podcast for now 8 years. And given this COVID lockdown, I happen to have 2 grandchildren who live right down the street. And the 9-year-old was feeling a little down because she missed her friends. So I brought her into my studio and I said, look, why don't we just talk about what it's like to be a kid in the coronavirus time? And I had her write down 4 questions that she thought other kids might want to know how she feels. And we did a pilot, just her and I, right here in my office. And we listened back. I edited it. That's giving me practice again on my edit suite. I'm not sending it off to anybody. I'm doing it myself. And then I put it up on Buzzsprout. Well, now kids call her and she does the interviewing. She's the host of Real Kids, Real Stories. And I look at her analytics and she's just turned the 500 mark of listeners. She thinks she's a little celebrity. But again, if a 9-year-old can do it, anybody can do it. That's my point.
No, and thank you for that. And also thank you for mentioning the launch, because that's something, again, I think people often forget about is, you want to get everything set up, make your plan, test things out. But then also, I think, really planning to invite people to join you, telling your friends, telling your family. Yes, eventually once it's distributed, hopefully new people will find you as well. But the truth is, it's really on you to kind of take that message and that passion and start putting it out there to people and talking about what you're doing in order to build a kind of real following or real group of people that share your passion. So, can you give us a checklist, Marilyn, of the kind of technology that you've had to learn? Because I feel like podcasting technology falls into like a mixture of hardware and software. So, I know you've mentioned Buzzsprout and iRig, and just so everybody knows, I'll make sure that I include those links in the follow up email for some of the stuff that Marilyn's mentioning today. But I'm curious just if people who are interested in breaking into this, like what is kind of that checklist they need to have to be thinking about?
Well, definitely you need to have a phone or some way. Now you can actually, in fact, when people call me now to do the interviews, we do it through Zoom. So I send a Zoom link. They connect with me through my phone, which is hooked up to my mixer, which is hooked up to my computer, which then I have a software, and I'll tell you it's called Audacity. And Audacity is a very simple edit suite that is extremely compatible with the kind of equipment that, again, I'm throwing out Buzzsprout, but it's such an educational platform. They have so many YouTube videos of people showing you how to use Audacity in such simplistic terms that anybody can learn how to use it. And so when we talk about software, um, you really, to be able to do a podcast, a quality podcast, it can be as simple as using your phone, uh, and over time, getting a good mic. That's always helpful. Good headphones. Mine are big. Some people use little pods. Some people use just regular headphones. Do you need to get to an 8-track mixer as fast as I did? Probably not. There are other ways that you can do what I'm doing on that radio sound quality besides buying an L8. Mine is a Zoom L8. Um, and I learned about the Zoom L8 by looking at going to webinars, going to uh, people's websites, looking at what are people using, especially podcasters. What do podcasters use and endorse? And interesting enough, I just do want to tell you this. When I did choose my Zoom L8 mixer, I bought it through a company called Sweetwater. Now, I'd never heard of Sweetwater before, but it's a company. Yay, shout out, love them. Um, and so the reason I went with Sweetwater was because they had 3-year no interest financing. And considering I needed to make that investment, I went with them. And I ended up, unbeknownst to me, they had free technical support. So the guy who was my salesperson also became my tech support. And every single day for about 10 days, he called me at a certain time and he taught me how to use this board. So I didn't have to pay any extra for that. He was as kind. And we came to realize that I was old enough to be his mother. So he learned how to talk to me as if he was talking to his mother. And that helped me tremendously to be able to learn. So when it comes down to technology, just do your research and start building it for yourself. What you can afford, what works for you in the interim, and then build from there.
Yeah, and I was going to say, I want to give a shout out to Sweetwater as well. When I started originally doing video and audio content, because I started doing my first podcast in 2006 for a client. We were actually doing a podcast for them, so it wasn't necessarily mine. But basically, I started with Sweetwater all the way back then, and the same thing. I had a rep. I could call him. I had the same rep for almost 10 years. And anytime I wanted to upgrade my gear, I would talk to him and let him know my problems, and he would really help. And then similar to Audacity, I use a piece of software called Camtasia, which I also started using back then. And we do have a question from Karen that maybe you can give some insight to, Marilyn. She was asking, is podcasting primarily audio, or is it video, or is it both? And I mean, I think we know most podcasters, it's really up to them if they want to be on camera at any point. But can you share a little bit about that decision to be audio, video, or a mixture?
I'd love to. Coming from a radio background now, I can say, oh, I have a radio background. Of course, it's all audio, and people in radio love it that way. Like, just all you have to hear is my voice. So my preference has always been audio. A couple of months ago, I interviewed a woman out of Washington, D.C., Tanya Fitzpatrick, who is a professional podcaster on a big, big level. I mean, she's interviewed Maya Angelou and Steve Jobs. I mean, she's a queen of podcasting, and she agreed to be on my show. So this was about a month ago. She linked into my Zoom, and I'm sitting there waiting for her, and she's on a video. And it was kind of jarring because I was still in my pajamas. I hadn't taken a shower. I was like not expecting to see anybody. And I was a little taken aback. And I was like, oh, Tanya, do you do your podcast like where you can see each other? And she said, oh, yeah, because then we put it on our YouTube. And, obviously she's a couple of steps ahead and had a totally different preference. So we ended up doing it that day on video. I went back and watched it, and it's like, oh my goodness, somebody, we need to know this is going on before we start doing that. In fact, she was my guest today, and, I got all kind of duded up because I knew I was going to be seeing her. But for the most part, I just do audio. Some people do audio and video and put it out on their YouTube, have a whole YouTube channel. I don't. It's, it's a lot of work. People have to recognize that if you want to keep doing this, you do have to, it's kind of a job.
Yeah, and I think
So anyway, preference.
Yeah, I was going to say it's really a preference of the podcaster. And I think to edit video and to know how to manage that aspect of it is an additional learning curve. So editing audio is one thing. And there's many podcasts that are simply audio and they've just got a nice graphic. So they might post their podcast as a video on YouTube, but you'll notice there's no video component. It's literally just the slide and then you're listening just like you would radio. We have another question. I couldn't see who it was from, but they were asking, and we've just got a few minutes, so I want to focus really quickly on how you're making money on your podcast, and then talk a little bit about what are the, number one ways that you're marketing to get people to pay attention.
Well, I've been very fortunate because I have sponsors for my show, and that took a long time to actually feel confident enough that my numbers were growing. I was following my analytics. I could see that my numbers were growing, and also that I felt I was really doing a service to the community. And who wouldn't want to come on board with that, especially around travel? So, of course, the first business that I approached about looking at sponsorship was the Asheville Regional Airport. What better partner to have with a travel show? And interesting enough, the first couple of years that I had the show and I would market to her, because remember, my background is in marketing. So I'm now on the other side of the fence where I'm selling my show. And I know that the analytics and the way that you look at everything is different through podcasting. It's not like the other mediums. So it took me a couple of years because her feeling was, well, we don't do radio. And I wanted her to understand my show was not just radio. It was something more. It was something that could bring the community to them and create a sense of community with the airport. And after a couple of years, she said, you know what, we'll give it a try. And our partnership has gone on now for 3 years. We do a lot of things together, and they put up a big backlit, proud to be a sponsor of Speaking of Travel. So I get, it's some soft income that comes in um, through the sponsorships. It's not going to be until you're a big, big name, probably. And even then, I think uh, creating revenue is not the most easy thing to do. I have a friend who just started a Facebook Live kind of podcast. She invites people to buy her a cup of coffee. That's kind of her thing. And when they say, here's $50, she says, I will promote you on my show. Her audience, maybe she's got a couple hundred people right now, but someday she might have a couple thousand. So that's that's how I do it.
Yeah, so because we've got just a few minutes left, and I know some people might need to go, I want to just let you all know that when you get the slide deck, if you're interested in learning more about the different podcasts that Marilyn's working on, I've included links to Speaking of Travel, to the podcast that she's been helping to produce called Brothers and Sisters Like These, which has been created by a veterans writing group where they're sharing their stories and is really, really amazing content. Also, the podcast with her granddaughter, Real Kids, Real Stories. So you can get some great ideas, I think, by watching the different styles of these different podcasts. Also, if you want to just learn more about Marilyn's story, she did a great guest spot on the Making It in Asheville podcast here in Asheville, North Carolina, where they interviewed her about all the different work that she's done and her journey in Asheville specifically and how much she's impacted the community here. So there again, they have their podcast posted to YouTube. So again, it gives you a little different flavor for some other folks that are doing a pretty regular program and what that looks like. And then you'll also have my contact information and more information about the JB Media Institute and different free opportunities and resources that we give for anybody who's working on their own digital marketing. But I want to tap into some of the other questions that have come in. One's from Brandy. She's wondering, what was your reason for choosing an 8-track mixer instead of a 4-track or smaller?
I think for me, the reason I went up with the 8-track is because that's what my producer had. And he was, he's got 50 years experience on me. So for him, when he purchased the Zoom 8-track, and he was coming from a radio engineering side. I was looking at the same board from the podcasting side. I decided, you know what, I'm going to skip up because I need to go to that level. If I were just doing it on my own, looking at all the resources that I looked at, definitely starting smaller would have been easier. But luckily, I've had all this time because I've been sheltering in place.
And then I wanted to mention too to everyone that when it comes to making money on your podcast, I think what Marilyn shared is very true. Once you build a following, you have the opportunity to get sponsors and supporters for your podcast. But I think the other thing that people are using podcasts for is really lead generation. So it's important when you have a podcast that eventually you might think about how you will get people to take that next step, whether that's to buy a product, hire you for a service, attend an online event that you're doing, or whatever it is. So I'm always thinking about podcasting in some ways as maybe the top of our funnel, right? So we're getting in front of new people, we're promoting it out there through social media, email marketing, networking, maybe even advertising if we have a budget, and we're getting new people to become listeners. And then really what we're doing is hopefully building a relationship of trust with them as a listener and sharing our passions. And eventually when they need support around different services, or they have questions, or they want a featured expert about a topic or something like that, they're going to be thinking of me as the podcaster or whoever the podcaster is. So I do think it's more of a lead generation piece when it comes to making money for a lot of different people and brands, right? Where it's a way to build your audience. And the bigger your audience gets, the more people know about all the other things that you do. But you want to be thinking about that and how you're going to share that, how you're going to collect their information over time and really build that relationship. We also have a question from Lisa. Oh, go ahead, Marilyn.
Well, let's hear her question because maybe it would tie in with what I was just going to tell
Oh,
you.
sure. Her question is just, do you have a standard template that you use when you're requesting for a guest to participate with your podcast? So, especially if you're hitting a guest that you've never met before, really, how do you kind of like have that plan together, get them to say yes or no, and then make it easy for them to become a part of it?
I do have a template, and that comes from really from the very beginning. That's something that you would want to think about when we talked about your different steps in getting set up. But you definitely want to be able to have a sheet. I have a information sheet that I send out once somebody's agreed to be a guest on the show that gives them the rundown of when they're going to call, what we're going to talk about. I have my guests give me bullet points, 5 or 6 bullet points of what they'd like to focus on. Now, for the most part, I already know something about the guest. And like I said, I'm booked right now through September. So now I'm where people are finding me. They want to be on my show. So I do a little background search. Sometimes I have a pre-interview where I talk to somebody because I don't want to have somebody who I can't, who maybe is a slow talker or just isn't comfortable talking. I'd rather nip that in the bud than get them on the show. You learn through experience. Um, so yes, I have that. They get that. And then we actually create a relationship, the guest and I. I stay in touch with them. They stay in touch with me. As we get closer, we communicate a little bit more. I put together my intro, how I want to introduce them. And my show is really conversational. So instead of it being I ask a question, they answer it, we know these are the basics of what we're going to focus on, but it can go in any direction. In fact, one time I had somebody say, look, you were talking about things that were not on my list. And I said, well, you led me into talking about that. And I was really curious. And you did fine because you're the expert in that field. So you knew what to say. It's like, some people they're just not used to that. So you have to have a little flexibility.
Yeah, and I'll give Marilyn a shout out because I was a guest on Speaking of Travel, that you did make it so easy to, like I didn't have to keep emailing you and asking you questions or, doing any of that stuff. You really took the lead. You reminded me different times. You let me know what you needed from me. And it was just like such an easy flow to be involved on my end. It felt really stress-free, which I think is an important
Well,
thing.
it's very important. And I can tell you, having been on other podcasts and know people who have been on other podcasts, that is not always the case. So, you don't want to wait until the day of where you're interviewing somebody you don't know anything about them. You just know that you want them to be your guest. It's really the responsibility of the host or hostess to be able to say, here's what I need from you.
And then
And
Stephanie, I answered your question in the chat, but Stephanie was asking, do we think that things like, Apple's earbuds, their wireless earbuds or their headsets work? And I had just typed in that, many of the modern headsets and earbuds that you can get now, especially the new wireless ones, which if you're using Apple products are pretty expensive, they actually work really well. I think I'm often surprised at how good the audio is now with those things compared to 5 or 10 years ago when it wasn't that good and I invested in a microphone. I feel like we've really seen an uptick in that technology because everyone now has one of these in their pocket and can be a producer of any type of media. So I just want to encourage you, Stephanie, if what you've got is a headset or earbuds, I think you can start with those first. You don't necessarily have to get a microphone, but test it and make sure that you feel good about the audio, that your own vocal volume is in a good place. Because for me, I tend to be louder, so I have to be careful when I have a headset close to me. I'm not blowing out the audio. I have to sort of talk a little softer than when I have my mic set up. And then Karen, this is a great question, and I know some of you have to go, but we'll keep taking questions for the next few minutes, if that's okay, Marilyn.
that's fine.
Great, thank you. So Karen's question is, what exactly is the role of the producer for you? Because not everybody has a producer. A lot of people are producing their own podcasts. But whether you're doing it yourself or you've got an extra set of hands, what is that actual role?
That's a great question. Because again, I've been very fortunate that I have a producer so that I can do really the basics, which is put together the files, record, put together the files, download them onto my computer, upload them onto Dropbox. He pulls them off and puts them through his computer. And what he does for me is he has all the other elements of the show, which include I have a music bed when you come in that plays the same song every time, but it's my theme song, if you will. And then he fades that out as I start talking. And then my show is split into 4 10-minute segments. So at the end of each 10 minutes, we actually take a break while he saves that segment. And then there's actually a break when you listen to the show where he inserts commercials. I also have Prestige Subaru as a sponsor. Asheville Rooftop Bar Tours is a sponsor. So they have actual commercial breaks in my show. And then we come back with a music bed that takes us into the next segment. Then we go out with a music bed. We come in with a different music bed, go out. He puts all that together for me. I don't know how to do that. I'm learning how to do that, but I don't know how to do that yet. So I feel very fortunate that I've had him to do that learning curve. Now with my granddaughter's podcast, Real Kids, Real Stories, I do that all by myself. So we recorded here on my mixer. It's recording on Audacity. Then I can see the file myself in the program. Then I've started to edit. And now I'm learning how to do changing the amplified, changing the sound, normalizing. I'm watching YouTube videos. What does it mean when it says blah, blah, blah? So my next goal is how do I put a music bed in her show? How do I do that? And luckily, my next learning curve will be multi-tracking. Randy told me which chords I'm going to need, and I went to Sweetwater and said, I need these. So I'm all set up to go to the next level of putting in music beds. So for someone like just starting who doesn't have a producer, just figure your learning curve is going to be a little bit higher. If you want to have a music bed and you want to have a fade out and a fade in and dress it up, well, you're going to need to figure out how to do that. Now, when I do hers, it's pretty basic. There's no music bed. There's no fading in or out. It's about 6 minutes long of question and answer, basically. And that's it. And that's fine. And given that basic level, she still has 500 followers. So you don't need a producer. You can do it yourself, but then you become the producer.
Yeah, and I think if you're producing yourself, one thing you might want to keep in mind when you're first starting out is just asking somebody else to listen and give you feedback. So that way you just get a second, set of ears on the whole situation, and they can let you know what improvements they think you might need. And I think it's just important to remember you don't necessarily need to make those improvements the next day, that they're just giving you positive feedback for how you can improve. And for all of us that are DIYing video and audio, it's this never-ending quest towards getting better at it. So it's okay to not be perfect, and it's okay to take positive, constructive criticism from people and then work that into your learning process as you're doing things. And then, Marilyn, I want to just go back to this final question really quick, because I know for me, in talking to people about their podcasts and promoting it, some of the main ways that we really focus on is really, I think, a content marketing strategy, which is looking at email marketing and building a list of people that you can keep telling about your podcast, using any of your social media channels as well to do that, especially collaborating with other people and your own guests, and making it if you're going to have them, making it very easy for them to tell other people about the podcast. So giving them a graphic, giving them a link where they can send people so they can just copy and paste and share it to all of their connections as well. I think that's the main focus where I've seen us having success with sort of growing the podcast over time. It's great when you put it on your website, but if all you do is put it on your website and then you don't really go out and promote it, it'll take a long time, I think, to get traction if you just keep distributing it through the podcasting channels and through your own website. It's really about going out there and jumping into the conversations about the topic. So, can you just speak briefly to how you're marketing or what the most successful strategies are that you've had, especially around these newer podcasts that maybe, didn't have the backing of iHeart?
Right. Well, I think that, for me, again, my background was in marketing and PR and but when you're actually marketing yourself and you're marketing your own brand, it's like, oh, where do I go with that? So, of course, for me, Facebook was kind of my first step because I was already familiar with Facebook. I was able to build a community page for Speaking of Travel. And I spent a good 9 months and a good investment in my website. Like I paid a professional graphic designer to create my brand because I knew coming out of the gate, those things were going to be important for me. So having a brand, having a look, having a website, um, and then putting it up on Facebook. Sometimes I boost on Facebook. I've been growing. Just really, my audience is growing slowly. I was never on the fast track. I never had any interest in going to Instagram and buying followers or anything. I just wanted to do it kind of grassroots, what feels good for me. The one thing I did was I started on my website what's called the Travel Club, and I promote that on my show. Go to speakingoftravel.net, and there's a whole page called the Travel Club, and that's where you can put in your information, and that goes directly to my database. So over time, I've been building that database to where I can send out newsletters, and then the newsletters have links back to the shows that go back to my website. So it's really kind of, again, somewhat intuitive where you start seeing where your numbers are coming from and where people are gravitating from. Um, so a lot of it is putting it out there myself. I do it every week. I make sure that my shows are out there every single week. Um, and then I depend on my guests to also put it out there on their uh, social media sites. And it's just been a gradual grow. So I think the most successful marketing strategies have really come from paying attention. Where are people coming from, and how do I reach them now instead of trying to do a big, my show is a very targeted type of show. So I know that I want to reach people who are travelers or who are adventurers or who enjoy being outdoors. It's not that difficult to find them. I go find an outfitter, talk to people, hotels even. Hey, people have to stay someplace. You be on my show, I'll be on your show. I ask people to send me content that I can put on my website. So that adds marketing appeal. So it's all about building community, Sarah, when you get right down to it. Just like any other marketing strategy, the most important thing you can do is to create relationship and create community, one person at a time.
Great. So we've got two more questions and then we're going to wrap up just because I don't want to keep anybody too long. Where do you host your website, Marilyn? Do you know who the hosting company
On Squarespace.
Great. And just so you know,
Yep.
so Squarespace, when you buy a website with them, the hosting is built into your monthly fee. If you have a website
Yes.
that's what we call self-hosted, my two favorite hosting companies are called Green Geeks, literally green like the color, greengeeks.com. And there's another one called SiteGround. So if you have a WordPress website or you're building your own website on a platform like Joomla or something, Drupal, any of those things. If you have a professional web designer building it, you would maybe get your hosting. I'm a big fan of Green Geeks because they're all wind powered, all US based. So they have a very almost a zero carbon footprint, which I think is really exciting for their servers. But definitely there's a ton of different hosting companies you could choose from. And then Karen, I see your comment. Karen is a student and a client of mine who's an RN patient advocate, and she's thinking about doing a podcast. She was asking, first of all, she might want to call it something like RN Patient Advocacy Talk. And I wanted to say, Karen, you could potentially look at podcasts out there, see if anybody is doing a podcast about your topic, and then, kind of go from there about what the name is, because I do think you could be as straightforward as that. But I do think you also could potentially come up with a name that has more of a value-based statement in it. So, it's about whether or not you really want it to focus only on RN patient advocacy, or if there's other things around healthcare that you want to talk about, you might broaden that name a little bit to attract people, like I said, from more of a values-based place to talk about healthcare in a certain way. Right? So I think there's some brainstorming you could do there to play around with some names and then give it to some friends and let them give you some feedback. But she also had a question about if she had a name for her podcast. You said you trademarked yours. She was asking about copywriting. I can speak to this as well, but Marilyn, can you talk a little bit about, really quickly, just copyright is a little different than trademark. Those are really two different things.
Right. And I might bow to your knowledge more of that, Sarah, because I'm not really that keen on it. But I will say this, what you were just saying about Googling other podcast names that are similar or content topics that are similar, that is something that you have to really pay attention to, because if you have a name and you put it out there and it turns out somebody else has that name, then you could have to take it down, as we've seen with restaurants and things like that. But why don't you talk about the copyright?
Yeah, so I just wanted to share that copywriting and trademarking are two different legal definitions. And in some ways with copywriting, when you write something, so when you write a script, when you write an article, when you do those different things, because you are the author of it, you are almost given the copyright automatically. You don't actually have to step in and do anything to get that copyright. Now, when you want to, when you're authoring books and you're creating other types of content, you can actually get a lawyer to help you really solidify that copyright and make sure that your content is all protected. But a trademark is really what you do when you want to really protect the actual brand name or maybe even the brand image. And trademarking, you also need a lawyer, and it's actually quite a bit more expensive than copywriting. So trademarking means you have to go through the US Trademark Office. And in the past, when I've done this process, what's interesting is, again, it's better to have a lawyer who can help make sure all your ducks are in a row and everything is exactly legally what it needs to be, because you can't buy the trademark, as to Marilyn's point, if it's close to something else that's already trademarked. So you have to do that research really thoroughly first. And they do have an online database that you can look through yourself, but I feel like really you need a lawyer to make sure everything is just where it needs to be. And then once you actually apply for the trademark, the interesting thing is you can pay all the money, apply for the trademark, and they can say no. And you don't get the money back. So the government, it's really worth having a lawyer to walk you through the process so that you don't have a situation where you try to apply for a trademark and they reject it, because they're not going to refund you anything for the application or for the time that you spent. And so that's why we see that when it comes to trademark law, almost everybody I know who's done that process got a lawyer to really help them get through it and to make sure, like we said, that all the research that thoroughly needed to be done to make sure that your trademark would get approved has actually been done appropriately. So those are two kind of separate things. And so I think if you're trying to protect the name of something, trademarking has more value than copywriting. Copywriting has a little bit more value when we're talking about whole pieces of content, larger pieces of information that you're putting out there. And then I see this last question just from Stephanie. You were saying that you're using WP Engine, but you've read that it's a bad idea to host on your own website because of space on the server. So I'm assuming what you mean, and maybe you can just type in the chat, is that it's hard to host your own video files on your website because they can actually become so large that they start to slow your website down. Marilyn, when you post things to your website, how are you actually doing that? Are you uploading the video files to your site, or do you have, is it embedded somehow from somewhere?
Well, actually, when you go to my website and you're on the home page, there's a little description of what the show is about, and it says, click here to listen to past episodes. And when you click on that link, it takes you to my Buzzsprout. And on Buzzsprout, I've got 300 episodes. So those are not sitting on my website. They're sitting on my Buzzsprout that I pay $18 a month for. So they go right to there. Now, I do want to say, because I have done I do a program on climate change with Dana Ruggiero, which is something that we do. And then I have a page on my website just for that show that she and I do. It's called the Speaking of Travel and Climate Change series. And there I put the audio. So I actually download that show in a post on my website. Can you actually, is that just a picture, or could you go directly to my website?
Sure. Let me see there we go. It should open it right up.
Okay. And then you could go to, I'll show you.
I'm sorry, I've got so many things open to record our webinar
I
today.
figured.
It's going to take a minute
That's
to load.
okay. Well, if it takes too long, I won't show you. But the bottom line is anybody can go to speakingoftravel.net, and when the menu item comes down, you'll see the Climate Listening Project. Oh, here. See where it says series? Oh, it's still taking a little bit of time.
But it would be under
That's okay.
here.
It would be under there. And then you'll see that there's the audio for that entire show. And I've created a series around that. There it is, a climate series. And the same thing with the Gourmet Highway, which is a little segment that I do with a guy down in Atlanta. He does a pre-recorded spot. He sends that to me, and I put that on my website. There's Dana and I looking really cool. So you can see, here's the show. This one was why biodiversity is important. And then right here, you can click on that, and that is the show. So the MP3 is actually embedded into my website. But for all my episodes, I drive people to my Buzzsprout.
Great. And so, yeah, just to refine a little bit of what we're talking about here, because I think it's kind of important, is there is something I think important to remember, that if you're going to upload audio and video files directly to your website, you are potentially going to run into an issue of slowing your website down. So that's why we have so many of these systems out there, like Buzzsprout, like YouTube, like Vimeo, all these other places where you can have all of your episodes located and then embed them on your website. So that way the video file or the audio file isn't necessarily on the page. It's streaming from like another third party like YouTube or Buzzsprout. And those systems are set up to make listening to audio and video much faster. So it's kind of like borrowing off their server so that your website can still load fast, but they can still click the play button directly on your website.
It really makes a big difference, and you get the analytics. Now, I get analytics on my website as well, so I can see when people click through, but really being able to see the analytics for the whole show, like in real time, that makes a big difference. And I do want to just put a little shout out. Buzzsprout has a podcast community. I think you have to join, you have to become a member. I don't think you have to have a podcast, but it's such a great thing. And it's a place when we were talking about marketing strategies, like every week they'll have, put in your latest episode, and boom, within as soon as they put that, boom, everybody's putting their latest episode. I'm so excited. It's like, oh, here's my latest episode, because I know that all these people are looking and they're seeing me, I'm seeing them, and we all feel like we're part of a community. And that's kind of cool.
No, that's so exciting. So again, I want to invite everybody to check out the podcasts, especially Speaking of Travel, Brothers and Sisters Like These. as well as real kids, real stories. If you like what you hear, then subscribe and start following them. Help Marilyn's granddaughter out since she's building an amazing following. Like I said, check out Making It in Asheville, especially if you're local to our area. I think this is, just a great local podcast where you can learn more about people in Asheville and how our community is kind of growing and changing. And then, like I said, if anybody has additional questions, you have a way to reach out to me and the JB Media Institute, find out more about what we're doing, as well as just reach out to me directly. So if you've got questions, you've got things that you want to talk about in regards to marketing or about podcasting, feel free to reach out. I know Marilyn and I are thinking about whether or not this is a subject we could do a bigger training on for people who would really want to get into the nitty-gritty. So if you're interested in that, feel free to email me and let me know that's something you'd want to hear more about. But Marilyn, I just want to say thank you so much for being here. I'm getting a lot of great positive feedback in the chat right now about how much everybody has learned and how much they appreciate our time. So our webinar is only as good as its guests. And I feel like having you here today has upped our game in some ways because I know you've got so many good ideas to contribute. So thank you for your time today.
Thank you, Sarah. It's always a pleasure to work with you and to partner with you and collaborate with you. So thank you.
Great. And to the rest of you, have a wonderful day. And I hope you'll join us next month for our digital drop-in on August 1st. Especially if you're in the tourism marketing industry, we're going to be talking about a new kind of tourists and how things have changed in 2020. And Justin and I are going to share some great strategies for how you can continue your digital marketing and really meet the community where they're at. And again, Marilyn, thanks for that final thought just on building community is really what I think the entire digital world is really about. And especially in 2020, I think we all know how important it is to come together, share ideas, share our passions, keep connecting and really making impact in the world. So I hope you all have a great rest of your week and I look forward to talking to you in the future.
All right. Thank you.
Have a great day.